You're watching one of an estimated nearly 3,000 U.S. airstrikes in Iraq in 2017. The U.S. was supporting Iraq troops in their battle against the militant group ISIS. A political science professor at the University of Mosul in northern Iraq told Newsy that he believes one of those bombs dropped on his home. Dr. Tariq al-Qassar says ISIS broke into his house with guns. That's when he ran with his wife and 4 children to a makeshift bunker in the basement, just 10 minutes before the explosion, and were trapped for days.
ومن خلالها استطعت أن أخرج بعد ذلك بعد أن تقدم الجيش بعد 4 أيام من الأنقاض.
Dr. al-Qassar's family survived, but more than 2 years later still can't afford to rebuild and can't return home. Defense officials could not confirm whether the U.S. struck al-Qassar's home, but the same day his house was bombed, the U.S.-led coalition acknowledges 6 airstrikes near Mosul. DoD says it follows a rigid targeting process for all strikes while attempting to avoid collateral damage. But for all of the military's success in its fight against ISIS, the DoD acknowledges civilians on the ground in Iraq and Syria have paid a heavy price in homes and in lives, which is why, since the Korean War, the U.S. military has sometimes offered small payments to help with unintentional damage caused by U.S. forces. They're called condolence or battle damage payments. Military records Newsy obtained show more than $50 million in payments to thousands of impacted civilians in Iraq from 2004 to 2011. Typical payments look like $50 to repair a damaged doorway or $2,500 for the death of a loved one.
A military commander has a responsibility to minimize suffering in the areas where he fights.
Colonel David DeRoche is a professor at the National Defense University, where the Pentagon educates the military's top leaders. He's speaking now in his role as a professor and not for DoD, and says condolence payments also have strategic value. They can stop locals from radicalizing.
If you don't do it, then of course you get the allegations of arrogance, of not caring. It becomes easier. The insurgents' message, particularly if you have American forces involved, is, hey, here come foreigners, they speak a different language, they have a different religion, everything about them is bad.
DeRoche speaks from experience. As a soldier in Afghanistan in the early 2000s, it was his job to reach out to civilians, sometimes moments after the U.S. military action mistakenly destroyed their home or killed a loved one.
We try to find out what happened, and then if we had the ability, sometimes money, sometimes things like sugar, flour, just bulk food supplies. We realize that you can't make things better, you can't make them whole, but that you could kind of mitigate the damage.
DeRoche helped write NATO's counterinsurgency manual, and he often references this FBI chart showing how someone radicalizes. He says the idea with condolence payments is to stop people moving from box number 1, pre-radicalization, to indoctrination and eventually action.
And for a person to become an insurgent or a terrorist, they make it through all 4 stages of it. You want to minimize the population of aggrieved people who become pre-radicalized and identified. And so prompt action by commanders, which is in addressing grievances, can be an effective way to minimize the population that starts down that process. Obviously, there's a number of other intervention points, but this is probably one of the most effective.
But the records DoD released to Newsy reveal that by the time al-Qassar's home was destroyed in 2017, condolence payments for civilians had dwindled to almost nothing, even though Congress authorizes funds that commanders can use for the payments every year. In fact, DoD records show the U.S. military made just 3 condolence payments in Iraq since 2011. In Syria, not a single payment since the beginning of the operation there. Even as the Pentagon admits hundreds of civilian deaths and injuries have continued over the same time and in the same places. The DoD's own report says more than 1,300 civilians were unintentionally killed by coalition operations in Iraq and Syria since August of 2014, including those for whom an expression of sympathy or condolences would be appropriate. According to monitoring groups like Air Wars, that number is a severe undercount of the real toll. So why did the payments stop in Iraq and never begin in Syria? The DoD says commanders have discretion over whether to make a payment, and it's not a one-size-fits-all tool, saying We use it in coordination with partner and host nation input when it is the most appropriate response. When it's not, we take other paths. When asked what those other paths are, the Office of the Secretary of Defense referred us to U.S. Central Command, which did not return multiple calls. But a separate DoD report says once fighting shifted from the ground to a mostly air war, commanders lost the ability to immediately connect with civilians harmed by U.S. actions. And DeRoche says if you can't offer a payment immediately, they can become less effective.
This is about goodwill. It's an intangible thing. It's hard to institutionalize the distribution of goodwill. It has to be a human thing, not a bureaucratic thing.
Face to face.
Yeah.
But advocacy groups say the U.S. did have options on the ground.
The U.S. is involved in a lot of different ways in Syria that there could be ways to verify and vet, properly attributed claims to the U.S. And I think they just decided not to.
Sahar Muhammad Ali oversees the Middle Eastern region at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, or CIVIC, which works with governments and armed groups around the world to reduce and acknowledge civilian harm. But we also showed her how condolence payments in Afghanistan have continued right into this year, even while the U.S. has essentially abandoned the program in Iraq and Syria.
The U.S. should have a consistent policy on this. It should not be ad hoc. I think acknowledging civilian harm is very important, but then what are you doing with that acknowledgement? It's really important to learn to change the tactics, to use better weapons so that you don't cause that harm to happen in the first place.
Al-Qassar says no one in his neighborhood was offered a condolence payment. Right now, the military is reviewing reports of at least 300 civilians killed in Syria so far this year. The number of payments made there stands at 0.